Well, hello there, studio teacher friends. Welcome to the Beyond Measure podcast with me, Christina Whitlock. I am your host, as well as your self appointed anytime piano teacher friend. Today's episode features a conversation I am so excited to share with you. If you have been out of the loop, this summer I am hosting actual conversations here on the podcast with some of my teacher friends. Actually, I am hosting double conversations with each of my guests, one chat that you'll hear here in just 1 minute on the podcast, and a second conversation that is being posted to the Patreon community. If you want more from today's discussion, Patreon membership is very affordable. Joining the Patreon community helps support the many moving parts behind this podcast. So, to those of you who are already members of the Patreon, thank you for helping me keep the lights on over here at Beyond Measure Podcast. Everyone else, I'd strongly encourage you to check it out at ChristinaWhitlock.com/Patreon. That's ChristinaWhitlock.com/Patreon. Thanks in advance for all of your support. So let's move on now, shall we? I've got a great guest joining me today. You are listening to the Summertime Conversation Series here on the Beyond Measure podcast. All right, friends, I need you to put your hands together for Benjamin Steinhardt, my thought partner for today's episode, as we re examine episode number 34 Cheers to Online Engagement. Benjamin Steinhardt is an internationally reputable teacher and pianist, and he can be heard performing throughout the New York metro area quite often. He places an emphasis on creativity and exploration in his teaching as he incorporates concepts from the Taubman approach, Edwin Gordon's music learning theory, Dalcroze, and other elements of somatic education. So, in addition to those credits, you may know Benjamin Steinhardt best for his numerous contributions to the piano pedagogy world online, including the fact that he is a co administrator for the Art of Piano Pedagogy Facebook group. That is an online forum of piano teachers from all around the world, currently comprised of 25.6 thousand members. It's absolutely incredible to imagine we have the ability to connect with 25.6 thousand piano teachers from all around the world, isn't it? Well, Ben works hard to keep that online space tidy, which made him the perfect guest to revisit this topic with. I will just say this episode 34 contains my 10 rules of engagement for online Facebook groups. And so, if Facebook groups are part of your teacher life, I would strongly recommend listening to that original episode in addition to today's. Without further delay, friends, I give you today's conversation with Benjamin Steinhardt. This is episode 173 of the Beyond Measure podcast. Ben Steinhardt, welcome to the Beyond Measure podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you today. And the real reason I wanted to have you on today is because I have a lot of thoughts about online Facebook piano teacher groups. And a lot of my listeners are very active, or at least active lurkers in those groups. Now, some of my listeners choose not to engage in them whatsoever, and I totally understand. But you happen to be an admin of the Art of Piano Pedagogy, which is a really large group. And I feel like that must give you some really keen insight into the goings on of these groups. And I was kind of hoping that we could chat about some of those things today. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds great. And thank you for having me, Christina.
Sure. So I just happen to believe that, at least for those of us who are active in these groups, It seems like these groups actually have a pretty profound influence on how we approach our teaching and how we think about our business and how we find new repertoire and all of those things. So I'm curious if you can give us like a behind the scenes peek at what it's like to moderate some of these really plentiful conversations. Would anything surprise us?
I'm not sure about surprising. I think most of it is sort of exactly how you think it would go. We vet members to make sure they're actually piano teachers. That's a big part of it. We try to weed out spammers, and we try to manage member conflict. And the other thing we try to do is just guide conversations to maybe interesting areas. As you said, I think there's a lot of dynamism that goes on with a Facebook group just because it's so international and there's so many things popping around. And also to be a place when crises happen, like COVID was a big one. We created a COVID group at that time, which is now kind of defunct because we don't need it anymore. But it was everything about how to handle online lessons and how to handle, making things sanitary, the whole spectrum of COVID stuff. Also being a place when crises happen, like the Ukrainian war. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the kind of hallmarks of the Art of Piano Pedagogy group anyway, is that I think you guys do really try to keep it like kind of humanitarian focused and look at those things. And I've said from episode 1 of this podcast that like those Facebook groups during the pandemic lockdowns were so invaluable. Like that, I had already loved this profession with my whole heart, but the way that teachers really stepped up to say like, oh, here's something that's working for me, or here's some free materials, like whatever, like it was so generous. And I don't know about you, but it really helped me out in a big way. So that was great. You mentioned spammers. I'm sure you see all kinds of things go through those vetting questions, but I'm curious what you think. This is always a hot topic about Facebook groups, especially in the way things are evolving now. But what do you think about self-promotion in Facebook groups? Because obviously people are going to promote their works. Some people like it, some people don't. What are your personal thoughts in that regard?
I think the general rule is to give more than you take.
Exactly.
I remember in the early days, we either had people who were constantly self-promoting themselves to the point of just making you nauseous, to those who had great things, books they had written and teaching materials that they had created, but they were just very shy about sharing that with anyone because they felt like they were, talking too much about themselves. So I think it's finding that balance between sort of showing your work, which I think is a wonderful thing to do, and also really trying to be active in discussions and engaging with others. And I think it comes back to being part of a community. I think that's really the goal in any kind of Facebook group, is to really be part of a teaching community.
I absolutely agree. I have a good friend who is very active in a lot of choral director groups, and they have very hardy online communities as well. And I remember years and years ago posting about, he had said thank you to a moderator of one of their Facebook groups because they kind of called him out for what they considered to be poor behavior, in that he had posted a question like, hey, I'm looking for programming ideas for a concert on, X topic. What do you have? And he said his mod called him out and said, hey, if you're going to ask for, advice, also try to contribute something. So for instance, we might see a teacher that comes online and says, hey, I need all the pieces about colors that you can give me, something like that. I'm planning a color recital. What can I program? And I've always remembered his experience because I feel like it's so helpful to then be like, I have X, Y, and Z already. What else can you give me? I feel like that is so much better in terms of being part of the community than just asking for help.
Yeah, and I just to tag on that, I think one of the best things you can do if you do post on a Facebook group is like in Jeopardy to post it as a question. So I think it's always much better to say, for instance, I have a student with ADHD. Can you please help me? Here are the issues I'm having with the student, rather than sometimes you get vents. Vents are, oh, I have this student and I want to fire them and whatever it may be. Or you get the other thing, you get, this is how you should teach students with ADHD. Here's my list. Rather than saying, here are some ideas I have. What are your ideas? I think you always have a better conversation that way.
Oh, those are so good, Ben. That's really great. I always think like with the venting posts, which Of course, that can be part of community too. It's great to kind of just share your frustrations amongst people who get it. But anytime somebody asks about a situation, like you're only getting a little bit of the actual story, right? So the words that people choose and the parts of the story they share are never the entire thing. So it's really mind blowing to me. Sometimes someone will share a story and say, this happened in my studio. I just need to vent, or, what do you think about this? And people are so quick to jump to diagnoses and new policies they need to institute. And actually, we can suggest those things, but people get really adamant that they know the answer when really we don't know what's really going on. So I think that's so interesting. So I'll tell you what, besides the things that you shared already, do you have any other rules of engagement where it comes to proper online behavior, or did we pretty much cover them?
No, I think the other thing I would say is I think a lot of online interactions, the way they're set up in other forums, say, Twitter and things like that, is they're supposed to generate clicks and generate reactions by being in a very sort of adverse posture. And I think the nice thing about, a group that's dedicated to some sort of hobby or professional thing like our teaching groups is, do you want to go into it being open to hearing other people's opinions? And I think one of the best things you can do is just avoid any kind of you statement. So it could be, something like, you're a bad teacher. That's sort of a very direct one. But even something like, you're saying this made me feel sad. And many times it's very good to share our feelings about things. But when it becomes sort of a judgment on another person, that's when you sort of get out of the realm of discussing, what's going on with teaching and more into sort of a personal attack realm. So I think if you can avoid you statements, that's a great way to keep things professional and also fruitful.
Yeah, I can see that even in the group rules for Art of Piano Pedagogy, you guys have been very clear about that very thing and how we do not go after personal attacks in that group. And I appreciate that so much. And it's easy. Sometimes we're just typing off responses quickly and sending them, and we don't realize how they come off sometimes. And so it's just helpful to have you guys there to keep us all in check. I appreciate that so much. So, do you have any pet peeves of piano teacher Facebook groups? Is there anything that drives you particularly crazy?
Well, one is, I think, a pet peeve of many people, which is called flouncing. If you don't know the parlance, that's when someone writes on, doesn't have to be the Art of Piano Pedagogy. I see it in my other groups all the time. I'm leaving this group because so-and-so wrote such and such, and they slam the door very dramatically. Or they say, without having ever even talked to an admin, they write on the page, the admin took down my post and because so-and-so. So that's a big one. I think the best thing to do in those situations is always to just talk to an admin. The good admins on Facebook groups are very used to dealing with these things and will give you a good explanation and have a conversation with you about their decision making, etc. Or will help you manage the conflict you might be having with somebody else. And the other one's sort of a little more specialized, but I find it bothersome when people write a really good open topic and they get a lot of engagement and they shut down commenting just because they're kind of done with it. They've gotten the answer they wanted, so it's time to shut off commenting. I think anytime you post something on Facebook, it's sort of useful to just think of it as a conversation starter. And if you get stupid answers, which you always will, you can just sort of ignore them. And if you find you're getting, 50 things in your notifications, that's fine. You can always turn off notifications for yourself and let it continue onwards. But it's just being a good community member is allowing conversations to continue.
I really appreciate that philosophy. And I'm always fascinated by this. Like when someone poses an open ended question, we think because we're posting to a group of thousands of members that we're going to get a cross section of responses. And you likely will. But let's face it, we all have certain topics that we are more prone to weigh in on. And so, for instance, if someone's asking about an addition or a historical style practice question, you're weighing in. I know you are. Because we can't respond to every post. We'd be there all day. And so I'm sure you kind of look at things like, oh, what do I have to contribute to this from my realm of expertise? And I have certain things, anything involving human behavior or the empathetic view, I tend to be right there, helping consider things from the parent side of the situation or whatever, right? I'm there. So we have to think about this, times the number of members we have in the group and know that there are certain top perspectives that are going to draw certain people. And it's not as open of a conversation as it always is. So
Yeah,
I just
I forget how many years ago it was at this point. Somewhere between 7 and 10 years ago, we finally got the metrics for who was participating in conversations, etc. And
Mhm.
what we found was there was far more engagement in terms of people looking at things than we ever expected. It was like we were getting 80 to 90% of our members logging in every week, which we never expected. But the people who actually commented were a small percentage. So the
Mhm.
majority of people in these groups are lurkers, but it doesn't mean they're not reading and they're not digesting what's being said in these conversations. So anytime you write something, you're not just talking to the people that you are immediately talking with, who are often the same 10 people, but everybody who's sort of looking in and reading there. So I think it's always worth keeping that in mind.
I think that is such an interesting statistic that I'm fascinated by that. I've always known there were a lot of lurkers, and I mean, I lurk in other groups. So, speaking of stats and numbers and that kind of thing, I remember having a conversation with you several years ago in Spokane about adminning this group. And I remember asking you about how many hours of your week you spend doing this kind of admin work for free, by the way. Thanks. So, what's that number like these days?
It's far less than it was, just because the moderation tools are so much better than they
Sure.
used to be. In the early days of these groups, I think I joined the Art of Piano Pedagogy, which was I think maybe in the original group back when Irina Gorin founded it,
Hmm.
probably end of 2012, early 2013. And then when Irina left and Lisa Milne took over in
Hmm.
2015 is when I joined the admin team. In those days, we were spending hours a week just trying to deal with everything with the conflicts and the promotions and trying to figure out where to go with the group. And now it's much easier because so much is taken care of by Facebook and just it's automatic declines and things like that. But we still, I don't know, still a few hours a week, I would say.
Oh, for sure. I would imagine. I really think like it's so easy for people to call out admins for things they don't like, as you've already mentioned. And yet you guys are really providing such a service that you never get enough credit for. So I really do appreciate the work you give to this because, again, I do find these groups to be hugely influential in our teacher space. So that was a big change over the last decade or so. Tell me, is there anything else that you've noticed as an evolving trend in Facebook groups over the last 10 years or so?
Well, I think it probably mirrors what goes on with new technologies, new
Mhm.
platforms. I was looking through the old sort of posts last night from those early days, and it was a really dynamic time in terms of
Mhm.
because there had been nothing like this. I mean, there had been, Piano World Forum and things like that,
Exactly.
but nothing on this sort of global scale and nothing this immediate and dynamic between such a wide swath of piano teachers. There were so
Mhm.
many interesting conversations that I don't think anybody had been having up until that point. So that was the really positive thing of it. The downside is back then there were so many more fights and arguments and blocking and all these things, usually over really dumb things like Yuja Wong's dresses or your makeup policy doesn't account for this or whatnot. So, people being angry with each other,
Mhm.
and I think that's calmed down quite a bit.
Good.
So as it's changed, maybe a little less dynamic than it was 10, 12 years ago, but it's also, I think, become just sort of a ubiquitous part of teaching and, conversations between piano teachers. It's just become sort of a general resource that most piano teachers go to at this point.
So you mentioned that these groups are such a part of the culture now. And so what would you consider to be the biggest advantage of participating in piano teacher groups?
I think again, it's that you get teachers from all over the world.
Exactly.
And I
Hmm.
think for people who, when they first join, it can be almost a shock. Even
Hmm.
things like, in the US, we don't really do exams much. A few people will do RCM, et cetera. But for much of the English speaking world, those exams are at the core of your piano teaching. It's really how you focus your whole year is things like
Hmm.
RCM, maybe RSM, or even things like, in many parts of the world, they use solfege to name notes. And we tend to use letters in the US.
Hmm.
And even with solfege, there's movable and there's fixed things like that. I think one of the interesting things, or the way that has really changed things, is things like Edwin Gordon's music learning theory. It could be sort of the Russian piano school for teaching kids, as exemplified by Irina Gorin and Irina
Hmm.
Mintz. The Talmud approach. Even teaching rote pieces, which was kind of taboo, I would say 10 years
Hmm.
ago, has really taken hold over the last 10 years thanks to methods like Piano Safari. All that stuff I think is kind of new, and I don't think it would have happened had it not been for the internet and for resources like this.
Wow. And thank goodness for that, because everything you just mentioned, I'm kind of an eclectic teacher. I pull from just about everyone because I think every method has things to offer. And not every method works for every teacher, but there's all of this philosophy, and a lot of it supports each other. And it's just a matter of how you go about manifesting it. But I am so happy that when I think about my exposure to a lot of those ideas, a lot of it did come from Facebook groups. So thank goodness for that. Let's go to the flip side. What are the most problematic aspects of these groups, or do you think they can be difficult in particular ways?
Uh, I think not specifically the groups themselves, but particularly after COVID, even when things kind of opened it up, you saw huge drops in concert attendance. I'm very involved in my local MTNA on the
Mhm.
state board and stuff, and huge drops in membership of like MTNA, Federation, Guild, all that stuff. Part of that because a number of teachers left the profession, but uh, I think that you have to find a balance between these groups being, augmenting your teaching and your relationship with other teachers rather than sort of taking it over. I think being involved in your local community is very important and getting to know local teachers. So I always just encourage people to, get to know the people around you and get involved, volunteer for local events, etc.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I see it all the time. People will comment, "Oh, I don't need to join my local groups because I have all of you here." Or, "Oh, you guys are my educational support system." And that's great. I mean, that's why they exist. And there is so much to be learned, as we've discussed. But there is no substitute for engaging with your actual local colleagues and those throughout the state. I'm like you, I've been serving on my state board for, I don't even know. And just the amount of influence those teachers have had on my teaching and the way I approach my teaching and my growth as a human being is really profound. I don't think I can say enough about it. And not in any intentional ways, but just by working alongside them in projects and little side conversations we've had here and there that have nothing directly to do with teaching. I am so profoundly changed because of those teachers. And I always think with your state MTAs and with MTNA and all of these other organizations, you have to put out a little bit of effort to get the rewards back. And I think that's what's hard, is that Facebook groups feel so instantly gratifying, and we get those dopamine hits and all of that, and it's just information that you can just take in and you don't have to exert any effort. But the effort is worth it. So I'm sure you agree.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think the numbers are slowly improving, and I think
Hmm.
it's the same reason that apparently like brick and mortar bookstores are kind of reviving now, as opposed to everybody being on their Kindle. There's no
Hmm.
real substitution for that face-to-face interaction.
Right, exactly. Well, I love that we agree on that. Do you have any thoughts? So clearly I do, because I'm asking the question, but every now and then situations arise where someone asks a question or makes a statement on a Facebook group, and then later it comes to light that they were using that for either research or to prove a point. I remember a circumstance, I don't remember which group it was, but a few years ago, where someone asked a question that was perceived to be like a silly question or a question someone should have known. And of course, lots of people pounced on it and said, "How can you be a piano teacher if you don't know this answer to this question?" And later it was revealed that that teacher was trying to show a student an example of how mean Facebook groups could be. And I felt really like, I don't know, I had feelings about it. So I'm curious what you think about people who use Facebook groups for undisclosed research or study or marketing research or whatever.
Oh, I just think it's highly unethical.
Yeah.
And there's the internet is forever. There's always screenshots. You're never gonna have total privacy. But I think part of what makes people feel comfortable sharing things on these groups is an expectation that it will stay within the group. So
Hmm.
I think that's just a big violation of trust. And in the groups I moderate, we've knocked people out for that reason. We've
Yeah.
blocked, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to. And again, that's a lot of emotional labor you're taking on behalf of piano teachers of the world. So I just have to say thank you again. So, tell you what, give us an idea. You've got a busy few summer months coming up. So, tell us what you're up to and where we can find you online and anything else you'd like to share with my listeners.
Oh, sure. So, my website is benjaminsteinhardt.com. But you can also just find me on Facebook. I'm there a lot. I have a couple pedagogy projects I don't want to quite share yet, but expect things to come. Just in the
Great.
immediate future, in about 3 weeks, I'm going to be at the Taubman Festival in Montclair State University in New Jersey. I'm going to be presenting and stuff there. And I'm giving a concert in Greenwich, Connecticut on July 11th with a violinist, wonderful violinist, Chie Yoshinaka. This will be our 8th program we put together, so I'm very excited for
Wow.
it. Yeah.
Oh, great. What is on the program? Can I ask?
Oh, yeah, sure. We're doing the Grieg Third Sonata, and then we're
Hmm.
doing works based on Romeo and Juliet by Bernstein, Prokofiev, and Morricone. So it should be very
Wow. Just a little program there.
just tiny. I like these little tiny bagatelles.
Oh, I love that so much. I can't wait to hear the report. So here's the thing. I came up with this great closing question for these summertime conversations. So the title of the show is Beyond Measure, and I want to know something you, Benjamin Steinhardt, feel that you love beyond measure.
Well, I don't think this will be a very original answer, but for me, it's the canines in my life, the
Oh,
doggos. My current one is Tippy. He's a Norfolk Terrier. Somebody asked me recently, like, what do you do just to like get through the day? And like, I think that daily walk with him, plus our hike, we take a lot of hikes in the woods and do little mountain climbing and things. I think that is just beyond measure for me, and it doesn't hurt when my husband tags along too. But
oh, good. Well, we all know where the rankings lie. You are not the first to answer their canine companions to this question. So we're definitely sensing a theme this summer. And, you were just mentioning these nice little mountain climbing hikes you take and that kind of thing. And we are going to have a nice little side conversation over in the Patreon community about your big New York City living life. So if anyone's curious for more on that, then make sure you check out the bonus episode in the Patreon. So to close us out, can you offer us up a quick toast to the profession?
sure, okay. So, cheers to friendship with other piano teachers. May we always feel supported and inspired by our colleagues. Hear, hear.
Here, here. That's a wrap on this episode, friends. But remember, there is more where that came from. Head to christinawhitlock.com/Patreon to learn more about how you can get access to all kinds of bonus goodies for just a few dollars this summer. I am convinced the Patreon community is pretty much the most affordable professional development on the internet. Pay special attention to the new offering called What Should I Teach Next? Because it's really good, if I do say so myself. One more favor to ask of you today. If you love this show, will you please take a moment and share it with other teacher friends? I know there are more teachers out there who need an anytime piano teacher friend in their lives, and I am ready and willing to do the job. Thanks in advance, my friends. That'll do it for today. Onward and upward toward making the world a more musical place.